Thank you very much, and I'm really glad to be able to talk about this book, and thank you also for those comments, which I found really interesting. So what I have to say will probably just perhaps be a footnote to these comments. I think one of the disappointing things would be to have a panel where everyone agreed with each other. So to try and introduce a little bit of disagreement, I'll start by firstly saying that I actually thought the book was really, really interesting, and I found most of its arguments convincing. But I want to focus on some of the tensions in there and pick up some of the things that Dennis said as a way of generating some kind of light as well as heat. There's a point in there in the book, where on page 215, where Reza says something like that. He tends to establish an Islamic polity is worthy of examination. And I think that's a really, really important point, and it needs to be made. And I think it goes back to the first point that you were making also in this talk, that to imagine utopias, to imagine any different way than what already exists, seems to be either a exercise in madness or triviality. Yeah? There's a very interesting point made by Slavoj Žižek a couple of years ago, and he would say something like this, that it was easy for us to imagine the end of the world rather than imagine the end of capitalism. And there's a sense in which we've all seen movies where the earth is destroyed. We never see movies where capitalism doesn't exist anymore. And by capitalism, and of course I just don't mean the economy, I also mean the way things are right now. So the basic alternatives we have: planetary destruction, or the way things are, business as usual. So the idea of being able to imagine alternatives, I think, is really, really important. I think locks into the idea of the utopian, and I think we'll go into that. But it becomes really, really problematic, because once you say yes, we want to be able to examine alternatives, the question you're really confronted with, how far does that actually go? Because nearly everything that we talk about, our very language now, both conceptually, mainly conceptually, is contaminated or bears the traces of the way the world has become over the last 500, 300 years or so. So in a sense, we have a very enviable task. And it's like those of us who've had to negotiate from one linguistic tradition to another. There's a moment when you don't really master the new language, but you know that the old one, or the one that you're using before, hasn't got the right words for what you want to use. So you kind of muddle along, using two different languages, two different grammars, hoping that somehow you'll be able to make that sense clear. And I think a lot of the stuff that we see right now betrays that kind of tension. And what I want to do is try to illustrate that through both, mainly through Reza's book, but also to pick up something Faisal said, to this kind of there's a profound tension throughout the book running around the normative nature of the Caliphate. And it comes down to this, and I think Reza mentioned it again in this talk as well, those of you who read the book. Is the Caliphate the name of a political entity that unifies or unifies most of the Muslim population in some way, shape, way, or form? Or is it the name of a political entity which is considered to be legitimate by most Muslims most of the time? Now, on one hand, the answer would be, of course, it should be both. But I would like to say that both these things are actually quite produce attention. You spoke, and throughout the book you mentioned, there's a sense in which there's a kind of a nationalization of Islam, or a national state tradition of Islam. You could have an Islamic state, which is also a nation. So Pakistan would be quite an interesting example of that, in a way that attempt to construct a Muslim nationhood as a basis for a political community, but at the same time circumscribe that to make it less and less universal, to make it almost act like a universal, as a national state. And the reason why I say this is that Faisal made the point, that the Caliphate has to be understood as post-prophetic, and I think we can all agree on that. The Caliphate actually begins seriously as a political entity with the absence of the Prophet. And I think that's pretty important, because up to the point of the Prophet there, if you are a believer, then all the issues that you may come up with, they have an authoritative resolution completely. You ask the Prophet, and what he says, depending on that, depending on your level of belief, depending on what caveats are made, you kind of accept as an authoritative answer or not. Yeah? Okay. In the absence of the Prophet, you suddenly have a space that you have to now then say, well, the Prophet would have said this. So there's a birth of analogy, etc., and everyone knows the kind of literature around that. But what it introduces is something else. It introduces something that I think is really important for us to preserve. If you are a Muslim, it seems to me that you have to accept at some point the ontological privilege of the Prophet. The Prophet, God speaks directly to the Prophet. That's quite special. Yeah? We don't know, and we'll have to recognize the special. And again, Muslims do. However they phrase it, they recognize it. But that ontological privilege, if we start extending it, as we have done, it can create lots of problems and lots of difficulties, and it's unsustainable in many ways. And this is where I think the issue of the post-prophetic and then which the Caliphate comes in. And I'll put it like Mahan asked the question, riffing on what Faisal said, that what if the most movements and projects which wish to establish an Islamic state have done so in the wake of the abolition of the Caliphate, so 1924, because before that they couldn't, because there was an authoritative answer to the question what it was. But they have done so by referencing Medina. And when Muslims talk about what the ideal society would be, consciously or unconsciously, explicitly or implicitly, they refer to Medina. What I would like to suggest to you is, what if Muslims, when they talked about an ideal society, had as their reference point the Caliphate? And I don't mean just the Caliphate which has been canonized and made sacrosanct through the notion, the historiographical convention of saying these are the four rightly guided caliphs. But I mean the Caliphate in all its ignoble and noble gestures, in all its corruptions, but also in all its heroism. What if the Caliphate was something that we knew, the history of the Caliphate, as well as we pertain to know the history or the biography or the events around the Prophet's life? And that, it seems to me, would open up a different kind of conversation amongst Muslims themselves and with others. Because it seems to me, and this came across a little bit there, even if you take the history of the Caliphate, Faisal mentioned the conjoining. I wouldn't put it like that, but I know what he means by it. And, but you know what? We know that, for example, in 1916, the colonial office and the office in Egypt was trying to establish an Arab caliphate as a counterweight to the Ottoman. We know that the convention that only the Quraysh or only Arabs could be the Khalifa was something which became problematized as a result of Western scholarship saying that they couldn't do it, because for a long time it was accepted. We know that, for example, letters of investiture used to go from the Khalifa in Constantinople to places far away as what is now Indonesia. We know that some of the Mughals, emperors, some did not acknowledge the Caliphate, some didn't want to talk about it, others were kind of like, would say things like, we are the Khalifa in India, but there's a general Khalifa. And this is one of the difficulties we have. When we try and talk about the Caliphate as a normative, we are confronted with a huge history of an institution which is at least 1400 years old. And within that history, you can find nearly everything that you want to find. And therefore, it doesn't become a useful way of saying the Caliphate is this or the Caliphate was that, because it could have been all of those things at different points. So we need another language to be able to assess and talk about the Caliphate as a historical institution, because once we say it's prophetic, we are saying it's historical. And once we say it's historical, then we are really locked into a very we could pick out different periods, different points, different pressures, etc. It doesn't surprise me that under pressure the caliph says this thing and some other caliphs say another thing. That I think is normal, and that we need to have a language of liberating that. And this is where I go back to the book in a way, Reza. I'll finish this. One of the things that you said, and again it's throughout the book, so it's not just there's a sense in which the idea of the caliphate has become locked into an idea of the Sunni, and you mentioned it several times that it's it was a Sunni institution, etc., etc. And as everyone knows, the problem the Shia had wasn't with the caliphate, but with the Khalif, with the particular caliphs. As an institute, they did not disagree. Hussein wanted to be Khalifa, and that was the whole point about their whatever. But there is a sense in which you read back the institution of the caliphate through the lenses of what we have been bequeathed. And one of them is a very strong sectarian view of Islamic history. And one of the things that I found quite interesting, both in the work of Khomeini, and if you look at this one, he says something like this, that, the Khalifa is, the Ottomans were corrupt, they were monarchists, etc., but they were still strong because they defended Islam, despite their anti-Shia. But if you look at the kind of conventional historiography, you read the history as the Ottomans were definitely anti-Shia, etc. Sometimes they were, sometimes they weren't. Sometimes they were very, very cautious about not exasperating. And one of the interesting things is one of the longest frontiers that hasn't changed was between the Ottomans and the Safavids, the Persians, who had sometimes accepted the Caliphate and sometimes didn't. So I think we are locked into this kind of dealing with very mobile entities without having a language that allows us to, or an agreed historical sequence that allows us to then make certain judgments around that. So in a sense, for me, the Caliphate is a metaphor, a floating signifier, if you will. But it is because of that, it is actually very, very important. Because it does two things. On the one hand, it tries to name a Muslim or Islamic entity that Muslims could be at peace with. You finish your account by saying you wanted a state which was accountable, where it was rule of law, etc. And everyone in the world could say they want a state where there's accountability, there's a rule of law, etc. But I think what is actually paradoxical and what is actually important, which distinguishes the Caliphate from those kind of idle things, is that the Caliphate is actually there to a way of restraining, and I'll put this poetic, well, what's the poetic? I'll put it in a colourful language, but it's there to restrain the great Satan. I'll put it like that. And what I mean by this is that the Caliphate has a purpose as also something that insulates and defends what is possible within, among the Muslim communities. Now that makes it a sense that it has to be an entity that is representative, not just of a variation of Islam, but of Muslims. And for that reason, it has to be not only post-prophetic, but also post-Musbi. Something which goes beyond kind of the sectarian divides. And that, I think, is really, really important. We, among Muslims, have many, everybody wants to be Caliphate, but no Caliph, but nobody wants to be the Caliphate. Everyone will address themselves, we will be the Caliph, I'm ready to be the Caliph, just give me a chance there. But the actual Caliphate is really an entity which has to transcend the differences that exist. Otherwise, it will not be that. And that imposes a certain kind of discipline around even the imagination. So for me, the idea of the Caliphate, if we're going to take it seriously, requires not simply dreaming about a better republic, dreaming about a better state, or dreaming about a better country, but it is also conceptual transformation, which means dreaming in another language, dreaming through possibility of making other kinds of connections and other kinds of histories. And what I liked about the book, and why I'm coming to this discussion here, because I think the book gives us a platform to start this kind of work, to raise it as a serious issue, which is not just historical, the Caliphate did this and then it died, but to understand that the idea and the metaphor of the Caliphate exists because it has a certain purchase right now, not just because of the crisis. I think it's something much more profound than that. And I think that's really important for us to have that discussion, because I think it's a possibility of imagining not the end of the world, but something different than what exists right now. And that's quite important for everybody.